Everyone in town knew Margaret Wells, the quiet woman with silver hair, soft eyes, and the kind of smile that seemed carved from years of sorrow. They pitied her, whispered about her when she passed the bakery, told their children to be nice to the poor lady. No one really knew her, and she liked it that way. They said her husband had left, her children never called, and she survived off a small pension. But inside that faded blue house on Maple Street, behind lace curtains and dusty frames, Margaret hid a truth that could shatter lives. For years, she had watched people come and go from her window, invisible and harmless in their eyes, until one afternoon, a moving truck stopped next door. A young couple stepped out, Evelyn and Daniel, radiant, happy, unaware. Margaret's heart skipped. She knew that face. Daniel. He was older now, but his smile hadn't changed. The same smirk that once haunted her, sleepless nights. The same man who had destroyed everything she loved. She gripped the curtain tighter, nails digging into the fabric. He didn't recognize her. Not yet. But he would. That evening she baked an apple pie, her hands shaking as she sliced each piece with precision. When she knocked on their door, Evelyn answered, warm and bright. "You must be our neighbor." Margaret smiled sweetly, her eyes flicking to Daniel standing behind her. For a fraction of a second, his face stiffened. He didn't speak, only nodded. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Margaret said softly. From that night, she became part of their lives. The kind old lady who brought soup, who told stories, who babysat their child while Evelyn worked late. Daniel played along, polite and cautious, but Margaret could see the fear in his eyes growing. He was remembering her, little by little. The night rain came, thunder rolling over the street. Margaret sat alone at her desk. An old photograph lay before her, Daniel with a different name, a different town, but the same cruelty in his eyes. She whispered, "You took everything from me." The sound of the wind echoed through the house. She reached for the drawer and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping his name, his crime, and her loss. Outside, a light flickered in the neighbor's window. Daniel was pacing. He felt it too, the past catching up. Margaret smiled faintly, her reflection trembling in the glass. They pitied her because they thought she was weak. They had no idea they were living next door to the woman who'd already buried one. Man sins and wasn't afraid to do it again. Days passed quietly on Maple Street, but tension grew like a storm cloud over Margaret's mind. Every morning she'd watch Daniel from her window, how he carried himself, how he avoided her gaze. He tried to pretend to hide behind smiles and normalcy, but she could see the cracks. Evelyn, sweet and naive, had no idea that the man she shared her bed with was a liar, a thief, and far worse. One evening, Evelyn invited Margaret for tea. The baby slept in the other room, and Daniel was late coming home. The smell of chamomile filled the air. "You know," Evelyn said, stirring her cup, "Daniel doesn't talk much about his past." "He said he was complicated." Margaret smiled faintly. "Complicated pasts have a way of catching up, dear." Evelyn laughed nervously, unsure what Margaret meant. When Daniel finally walked in, the teacup in Margaret's hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from memory. His eyes met hers, and for a second the room went silent. He knew, she knew. They were no longer strangers playing a game of politeness. After that night, Daniel began to act differently. He walked her to her car once and muttered, "You should have stayed gone." She froze but didn't respond. That sentence alone confirmed everything. He remembered the man she once trusted, the one responsible for her husband's death, was standing in front of her, and fate had brought him right to her doorstep. The next morning, Margaret went to the attic. Dust danced in the light as she opened an old chest. Inside were letters, police reports, and a single locket, her husband's. She pressed it to her heart and whispered, "This time, you'll pay." That night, she wrote an anonymous letter, signed it with a name Daniel would recognize instantly. When Daniel opened his mailbox the next morning, his face went pale. Evelyn found him outside, shaking, holding the letter. "Who's M.W.?" she asked. He couldn't speak. He dropped the paper, and she saw the words that made no sense to her but froze him in place. I know what you did in Boston. Daniel barely slept that night. The letter lay on his desk, the words burned into his mind. I know what you did in Boston. He tore it up, but the damage was done. The past had found him again. Evelyn noticed his hands trembling at breakfast. Are you okay? She asked gently. He forced a smile, muttered something about work stress, and left. But Margaret was watching from her porch, a faint smile playing on her lips. She remembered Boston vividly. The investigation, the lies, the way Daniel had twisted everything to make her look unstable. He had walked free while her husband's reputation was destroyed. And now, years later, justice had a new face hurts. That afternoon, Margaret visited the small town library. In the archives section, she opened an old folder labeled Boston, 1999. Inside were newspaper clippings, one showing Daniel's photo, different name, same eyes. She copied every piece and returned home, her heart steady for the first time in years. At dusk, she placed an envelope on Evelyn's porch. Inside, an article about a financial scandal and a man named David Cole, Daniel's former identity. She didn't sign it. Hours later, she saw their lights flicker through the blinds. Evelyn's voice echoed faintly through the walls. Daniel, what is this? Who's David Cole? Daniel shouted something she couldn't make out, then silence. Margaret leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, listening to the chaos unfold. She wasn't doing this for revenge anymore. It was about truth, about peace. The next morning, Evelyn came to her door, eyes red. Did you send this? Margaret looked at her, pretending confusion. Oh dear, no. But maybe you deserve to know who you married. Evelyn's lips trembled. He's not who he said he is he? Margaret didn't answer. She simply closed the door, her hands shaking from the weight of her own deception. Upstairs, the wind rattled the windows. Daniel was unraveling. He knew she wouldn't stop, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt power instead of pity. Daniel stopped pretending. The mask had cracked, and the panic beneath it was spreading fast. He spent hours in the garage, pacing, drinking, muttering to himself. Evelyn kept her distance now, frightened, confused, questioning everything. Margaret, meanwhile, continued her quiet routine. She watered her flowers, fed the stray cat, waved politely to neighbors. To anyone watching, she was still the sweet widow next door. But at night, she sat by the window, writing in her old notebook, documenting everything. Each entry ended the same way. He doesn't get to win again. One evening, Evelyn appeared at her door again, clutching another envelope. He's lying to me, she said, her voice trembling. He says someone's trying to ruin us. He said you're dangerous. Margaret smiled sadly. Sometimes the truth feels dangerous when you've lived in lies too. Evelyn stared at her. For a long moment, tears welling up. Who are you, Margaret? The question lingered, heavy in the air. Margaret took a breath. Someone who lost everything because of your husband. She closed the door gently, leaving Evelyn in silence. The next day, Daniel came to her yard. We need to talk, he said, his tone sharp. Then talk, she replied calmly. His eyes darted, desperate. You don't know what you're doing? Margaret tilted her head. No, Daniel, you don't. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. If you tell her anything else, You'll what? She interrupted softly. You already destroyed one life. Will one more make you feel safer? He froze. For the first time, she saw fear, not arrogance, in his eyes. That night, Daniel didn't go home. Evelyn called the police the next morning. He'd vanished, leaving behind his car, his phone, and the shredded remnants of Margaret's letters. Margaret sat on her porch, watching the flashing lights down the street. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just whispered it's starting again because she knew this wasn't over. Some ghosts don't disappear, they wait for you to open the door. 3 days passed and no one had seen Daniel. The police searched the nearby woods, questioned Evelyn, even knocked on Margaret's door. I wish I could help, she said softly, eyes full of practiced worry. Inside, her pulse was calm, steady. That night, when the street quieted and the red-blue lights faded, She went to her basement. The air was cold and damp, the single bulb flickering above her. She walked to an old cabinet, pulled out a box, and opened it carefully. Inside was Daniel's watch. She turned it over in her hand. "Tracing the engraved initials DC, you never learn, do you?" she whispered. Memories flooded back, her husband's last night alive. The betrayal, the police dismissing her accusations. Daniel had buried the evidence then. Now, it was her turn. Upstairs, she heard a knock. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands shaking. "They think something happened to him," she said, almost whispering. Did you see anything?" Margaret studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, dear." They sat in the dim kitchen. Margaret poured her tea slowly, the silence stretching between them. "Do you think he's alive?" Evelyn finally asked. Margaret met her eyes, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes people disappear because they're afraid of being found." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I loved him," she said. "Even if he lied, I still loved him." Margaret nodded slowly. Love can blind you to what someone really is. When Evelyn left, Margaret returned to the basement and opened another box, a collection of old photos. Newspaper clippings and notes she'd written over the years. At the bottom was a single photograph, her husband standing beside Daniel, both smiling, unaware of the storm their choices would bring. She placed Daniel's watch on top of it and closed the lid. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel weak. She felt seen, powerful, and utterly alone. The police ruled Daniel's disappearance as voluntary. He probably ran off, they told Evelyn. Men like him always do, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had happened. Margaret continued her calm facade baking pies, chatting with neighbors, attending Sunday service. Yet every night when the town lights dimmed, she'd sit by her window and stare into the darkness where Daniel's house stood silent. The curtains were always drawn now, the once bright home hollow and still. One evening, Evelyn returned. Her eyes were sunken, her voice hoarse. "They found his car by the river," she said quietly. "No sign of him." Margaret's hands tightened on her teacup. "I'm sorry, dear," she whispered, though her tone carried something that almost sounded like relief. Evelyn looked at her strangely. "You don't seem surprised. Life stops surprising me a long time ago," Margaret said softly. Evelyn left soon after, and Margaret returned to her solitude. But that night, she heard something she hadn't expected. A faint knock. She froze. 3 gentle taps at her back door. Her breath caught as she turned the knob. There was no one there, only a small envelope resting on the step. She picked it up, her hands trembling for the first time in years. Inside was a piece of paper with 3 words written in shaky handwriting. "I remember everything." Her heart pounded. Daniel wasn't gone. He was watching her, like she had watched him. The tables had turned again. She closed the door quickly, locked every window, and sat in the dark, listening to the wind. For the first time, Margaret felt fear creeping back in. She had waited years to confront her past, but now her past was coming for her. The pity she once despised had turned into the one thing she longed for, because this time she wasn't sure she'd survive what was coming next. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt amplified: the ticking clock, the rustle of the wind against the shutters, the faint creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. The note sat on the table, those 3 words burning into her mind. Asterisk, I remember everything. Asterisk, she had thought it was over. She had buried that part of her life, both figuratively and perhaps literally. But if Daniel was alive, if he remembered, everything she had built in this quiet little town would collapse. She sat in silence until dawn, staring at the horizon. By morning, she decided, she would not wait for him to come. She would find him first. She dressed carefully, as if preparing for something sacred. In the mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back, her face calm but eyes sharp. Alive. At the library, she searched through public records. Nothing. No transactions. No calls, no sightings. Daniel Cole had vanished again. But as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, a man in a gray coat caught her eye. He stood across the street, pretending to read a newspaper. When their gazes met, he folded it and walked away. Her heart raced. Was it him? Or someone watching her for him? That night, she found a second note taped to her front gate. Asterisk, you think you won? Asterisk. It wasn't Daniel's handwriting this time, more deliberate, controlled. She tore it down and burned it over the sink, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Days passed, each one more uneasy than the last. Evelyn moved away suddenly, saying she needed a fresh start. The house next door went dark. Margaret's once peaceful street now felt like a ghost town, every shadow heavy with memory. Then one evening, as the rain began to fall, she heard her back door creak open. "You always liked playing God, didn't you?" a voice whispered. It was him, older, weaker, but unmistakable. Daniel stepped out of the shadows, his face half hidden beneath his hood. Margaret didn't flinch. "You destroyed my life," she said quietly. He smiled, a broken, haunted smile. "And now you've destroyed mine." Lightning flashed. For a moment they stood like two survivors on opposite sides of the same storm, each holding the other's sins in their hands. Danielle took a step closer. "You can't bury the truth forever, Margaret," she whispered, almost to herself. "I already have." The next thunder drowned out everything. The storm raged all night. By morning, the entire town buzzed with whispers, a power outage, a tree fallen over Main Street, and the sound of something like a scream echoing from the hills. Margaret watched the news, but no one mentioned Daniel. She poured her coffee with steady hands, pretending everything was normal. But her reflection in the window betrayed her. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a lie. She decided to drive to the lake, the place where it all began and where she thought it had ended. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. As she walked down the muddy path, her memories came rushing back, the betrayal, the blood, the fire. Daniel had taken everything from her, once her son, her peace, her future. She had sworn to never be a victim again. But then she saw it. Footprints, fresh ones, leading down to the water. Someone had been here, maybe just hours ago. She followed them until they disappeared near the dock. There, half submerged in the mud, was a phone, Daniel's phone. She picked it up with trembling fingers. On the screen, a single video waited. She pressed play. The image flickered. Her kitchen, filmed from outside through the window. The date was from last night. Daniel's voice whispered, "You never learned, did you?" Her blood turned cold. He had been in her house, watching her. Again. Margaret stumbled back, dropping the phone into the lake. Her heart pounded as she realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. Daniel wanted her to feel what he felt. Powerless, hunted, alone. Back home, she locked every door, drew every curtain. But the silence felt too loud. She sat on the floor, clutching a photo of her son. "I did what I had to," she whispered through tears. Then, from the hallway, she heard it. The floor creaked once. Then again, slow, deliberate steps approaching her room. She reached for the fireplace poker, breath caught in her throat. A shadow moved beneath the door, and then a voice she didn't recognize whispered, "He's not the only one who remembers." Margaret froze where she stood, the poker still clutched in her shaking hands. The voice behind the door was soft, trembling, nothing like Daniel's. Slowly she turned the handle. Standing there was a young man, soaked from the rain, eyes red from crying. "You don't remember me," he said quietly, "but I remember you. I'm Liam." The name hit her like a wave. Her son's middle name was Liam. Her knees went weak. "That's not possible," she whispered. "My son, he died." He shook his head. "No, he didn't. Daniel took me away. He told me you didn't want me, that you chose your life over mine." His voice broke. "I believed him, until I saw the letters you wrote, the ones he hid." Margaret's tears came before her words could. The room spun as she fell into his arms. The years of guilt, fear, and silence finally breaking open. She buried her face against his shoulder, whispering his name over and over, as if saying it could undo the lost time. They sat for hours, the rain outside softening to a quiet drizzle. Liam told her everything, how Daniel had raised him under a false name, how he'd discovered the truth after Daniel's death months ago. He had come to find her, but fear held him back until last night, when he saw Daniel's phone and realized she was in danger. Margaret listened, hands trembling, eyes wide with disbelief and sorrow. When he finished, she reached for his hand. "You didn't lose a mother," she said softly. "You were stolen from one." They went to the lake the next morning. Together, they watched the sunrise, gold light spilling over the water that had witnessed so much pain. Margaret took Daniel's old locket from her pocket and threw it into the water. "He doesn't own a single memory of us anymore," she said. Liam smiled through tears. "So what now?" Margaret looked at him, her voice steady for the first time in years. "Now, we start over. Not as the woman everyone pitied, but as the woman who finally got her son back." The camera of the world, the gossip, the pity, the whispers faded to black. All that remained was the sound of the lake, the warmth of the sun, and the quiet heartbeat of forgiveness. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to breathe it in, the pain, the healing, the hope. Sometimes, the people we think are broken are the ones who learn to stand the strongest. If you felt something while listening, leave a comment below. Tell me what part hit you the hardest. And don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories like this. Real emotions, real people, and second chances. Thank you for watching, and remember, every ending can still be a beginning.